Guys, we're just going to give it maybe just a couple more minutes and then we will begin. Maybe 1-2 more minutes and then we'll begin. I'll just begin by, while we're waiting for the others, I'll begin by introducing myself and introducing the company. So my name is Alexander Sitwell. I'm from England, and actually I'm currently in England. And I spent 1 year studying theology at Durham University, but then having decided to switch course, I moved over to Georgia, where I was working with English book education to expand my horizons and to experience a different culture. And I have to say, I absolutely love Georgia. So the company I'm currently working for and the company which has brought you this webinar is called English Book Education. The company is divided into 8 pillars, providing services such as education, primary and secondary school education, preschool education, unique learning, which is our English language school situated in Varkey, bookshop.g, qualifications, and the Queen's and King's Club. So I'm personally affiliated with the King's and Queen's Club, and I suppose we should talk about what is the King's and Queen's Club and what do we do. To become a member of the King's and Queen's Club is to become part of a national and ever-growing book club. Working with over 40 schools, it is my job to visit each school once a month, where we will have a discussion about the title which the students have been given. We will explore key themes, ideas, as well as connecting this all to the historical context and the author themselves. So during the session, typically what we do with students is we discuss the book and we get them to do a presentation on the book, which allows us to sort of assess their communication skills, something we really want students to build up, presentation and communication skills, because we think that's a really, really valuable skill to have. Anyway, enough about our company, and let's move on to the topic at hand. This is Shakespeare Month, and we'll be discussing different Shakespeare plays each week. And today we're going to take a look at Romeo and Juliet. If at any point during this webinar you would like to ask a question or say something, please don't hesitate and just put your questions or things you'd like to say in the group chat, and I will keep a close eye on it. Right, so our agenda today, I've introduced our company. We're going to first begin by looking at the origin of Romeo and Juliet, where Shakespeare got the idea from in the first place. Then we're going to look at some themes. We're going to take a look at the genre. We're going to take a look at the style in which it is written. And we'll also consider things like original performance conditions. So how was it performed? How was Romeo and Juliet performed in Shakespeare's day? Then we're going to look at another theme of passion, love, and youth. And then finally, we'll discuss the impact of Romeo and Juliet. All right. So let's begin with the origin. And Shakespeare says this himself. Before Romeo and Juliet was written, there was actually a 3,000-line narrative poem written by Arthur Brooke in 1652. And this narrative poem was named The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. So these characters already actually existed before Shakespeare wrote his play. But we need to understand what this poem is about fundamentally. It's actually a warning. Arthur Brooke's poem was a warning sort of against young love, impulsive love, neglecting the opinion and authority of your parents who might tell you something different about what your approach to love should be. Okay, so it's very much a warning, because at the end of this poem, Romeo and Juliet die as well, as a consequence of basically approaching love in this very irresponsible, impulsive way. Now, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, while it takes inspiration from this poem, it's fundamentally different because it has a fundamentally different message. He doesn't portray the relationship between Romeo and Juliet as a warning against impulsive love. If anything, it's a lot more sympathetic to young love. It's a lot more sympathetic to passionate love, to how should I say it? To sort of naive love. He actually celebrates it in a way. Even ideas such as love at first sight, which to a modern day reader might be sort of quite absurd, that you can fall in love with someone the moment you see them. Shakespeare actually, he elevates this, and he says that actually that's a very valuable thing. Okay. Although it's not completely like that, there is still an element of respect and distance between Romeo and Juliet, which is best shown in the famous scene where Juliet shouts out from the balcony, "Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, Romeo?" And Romeo's below the balcony, and they have this incredible poetic conversation, which is actually very intellectual, but it also shows a distance, quite a sort of reserved, conservative distance between them, despite the fact that they're expressing their love for one another. So where does Shakespeare's appreciation of the romantic come from? Where does it come from? And before I mention that, the other key difference actually between the poem and Shakespeare's play is that in the poem, Juliet is 16 years old, whereas in the play, she's 13. So at the age of 13, it's almost like he creates a character in which there's very little room for, let's say, impropriety, very little room for the antithesis to innocence. So she's very much, so at 13, people are much more, let's just say, yeah, innocent, kind. They have less bad in their heart, if that makes sense. Anyway, moving on, where does Shakespeare get his appreciation for romanticism? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from a certain poet named Petrarch. And Petrarch is an Italian scholar and poet during the early Italian Renaissance. And he was always writing about love. He was also a humanist, by the way, but one of the key theme of his writings was love. And he approved of intense adoration. He thought it was almost like a spiritual thing to have these incredibly deep connections with people. But he also believed in things like love at first sight. The idea that you can fall in love with someone the first time you see them. Love is almost like this higher spiritual power that exists outside of the human experience. So we can already see Shakespeare inputting this love at first sight into his play. But also, Petrarch kind of had to believe in love at first sight. Why? Because all of Petrarch's poems were written to a woman he had never met and only seen once. So it kind of makes sense, this idea of love at first sight, if you're writing about someone you've never actually had a relationship with. A lot of us might be skeptical about this notion of love at first sight. I certainly am. And I suppose love at first sight, if we're looking at this in a very skeptical kind of way, it might be sort of emphasized by mystery. We might see someone we don't know very well, think we've fallen in love with them, and that might be because we project certain things onto them. We sort of idealize them. We idealize them more than they're deserving of it. But anyway, you guys make your minds up about that. Can love at first sight be a thing? Up to you to decide. But of course, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is not just about love. It's deeper than that. It's not just a love story about two individuals. It's far more complex, and there's some other significant themes to consider. And what you should consider, first of all, is that many of Shakespeare's plays are written in faraway lands, in faraway times. they're usually written about places which are different from the place in which he was writing. They're not typically set in England, in England during the time in which Shakespeare was writing. So I'm curious. Let's think about this. Why do you think Shakespeare might have been writing about other places which were completely disconnected from where he was living? And remember, to give you a clue, Shakespeare was often writing about politics, and there was a lot of social commentary going on in his plays. So why do you think Shakespeare often set a lot of his plays in a different place? Romeo and Juliet takes place in Verona, in Italy, right? A world which is completely different from England. This is a Mediterranean city where it's very warm. People are a lot more, let's say, passionate. You know what the stereotype of the typical Italian is. This is a place very different from England. So why do you think he might have done this? Why do you think he would often set his plays in other places? Okay, I'll give you the answer, but if you come up with any suggestions, please do say. Essentially, when we look at Romeo and Juliet, a really key theme in Romeo and Juliet is loyalty. Okay? Can I repeat the question? Yes. What I'm asking, Shakespeare often sets his plays in different places to England. His plays are usually set in Italy, Greece, or in a completely different time period from his own. Remember, Shakespeare was writing in England. So why do you think Shakespeare would write about other places? Why would he set his play in a different place from England? Why would he do that? So I think the answer is this. Shakespeare's plays are often very political. Maybe they were metaphors? Yes. You'd need to expand on that for me to know what you mean. Like, Well, let me tell you what I think the answer is to this, and then perhaps you guys can add more to what I've said. Shakespeare plays are often very political, and Romeo and Juliet is a political play because it brings into this question of loyalty. Who should you be loyal to first and foremost? Your feelings, as Romeo is, your family, your friends, faith, or the law? And the reason this is brought into question is because, remember, Romeo and Juliet come from different families, the Capulets and the Montagues, and these are families which are quarreling against each other. They're fighting against each other. And of course, neither family would approve of Romeo and Juliet falling in love with each other. So who should you be more loyal to in that specific situation? Should you be more loyal to your feelings? Should Romeo be more loyal to Juliet? Or should he be more loyal to his parents who tell him, don't marry Juliet? Or there's also the other issue. There's a situation where Romeo and Juliet, they're attempting to marry, but then I believe it's one of Juliet's cousins challenges Romeo to a duel. And Romeo essentially kills him, Tybalt. He kills Tybalt, who's from Juliet's family. And then the prince discovers this, and the prince tells him, you must leave Verona, I'm exiling you, and if you ever come back, I will kill you. So again, Romeo's confronted with another loyalty. Should he be loyal to the law, which is telling him to leave Verona and never to come back? Or again, should he be loyal to his feelings? Okay, so loyalty is a really key question here. Who is the main source of authority in your life? Your feelings, your family, the law, your friends, God? And these are very, let's just say, these are very controversial questions for the time. And these were questions that were quite central to Elizabethan England, but they weren't expressed very loudly. And the reason they weren't expressed very loudly is because if you said anything that kind of went against the king and the queen, you probably would have been executed. So if Shakespeare is now setting his play in a different country from England, it is a lot easier for him to talk about these themes and to talk about these issues of politics and authority and the law. Okay, he's almost distancing himself from English politics, and he's talking about Italian politics as well. So Nino Shergalishvili said, because of British traditions and the way they think. If you mean what I mean, then I agree with you. If by that you mean that basically English traditions are very conservative and strict and you can't criticize them, then yes. And there's definitely a utility in Shakespeare setting his play somewhere else. It means he can comment about these English issues, but in a much more free way, because he's talking about a different country. They may have executed him for laws, that's why. Exactly. If Shakespeare had set this play in England and started raising all these questions about England, he would have been in very, very hot water. Okay. I think I've slightly exhausted that point, so we could probably... Shota Rustaveli had the same style, by the way. Okay, so did Shota Rustaveli also, would he talk about different places? He probably wouldn't have spoken about Georgia, maybe he sort of... Yeah, okay, interesting. Nice. I ought to check him out, really. It's a bit embarrassing. I haven't read any Shota Rustaveli. Okay. And just quickly, just one more point is this play is also really about friendship and not so much loyalty. Well, it's about loyalty and friendship, but Mercutio, who is Romeo's best friend, there's a scene where actually he sacrifices himself for Romeo. So we understand that this play is also not just about love between a girl and a boy, it's also about love between two friends. Anyway, let me continue. So the next thing to consider here, and this is not as simple a question as you think, or you might think. Let's consider the genre of Romeo and Juliet. Okay, and I'll give you guys time now. What do you think the genre is of Romeo and Juliet? And while you're thinking, I'll give you a quick summary of the story. Romeo and Juliet, set in Verona, is about two feuding families, the Capulets and the Montagues. Okay, and they're constantly fighting. And from each family, you have Romeo and Juliet who fall in love, whose love is very controversial, and whose love is incompatible with their reality. And then as a result of the incompatibility, they end up dying. Despite being two very good characters, two innocent characters coming together, they die as a result of perhaps being too naive, or perhaps because what they want is not in line with their reality. So, genre. What genre do we think Romeo and Juliet comes under? There's romance, there's death, there's comedy, but which one do you think it is fundamentally in terms of its narrative structure? Two people fall in love in a harsh world, but they both die at the end of the story. What do we think it is? Romance and drama, says Mariam. Okay. Tragedy. Okay. Yeah, so the question I'm asking is fundamentally, what genre does it come under? And I think there is a correct answer to this in terms of narrative structure. Okay, well, let's first consider someone that Shakespeare may have been studying, and that's Aristotle and Aristotle's approach to theatre and drama. And Aristotle said that there is a tragic structure. So tragedy, the genre of tragedy, has a very specific structure. And it seems in some ways that Romeo and Juliet lines up with this structure. So how does Aristotle describe, Aristotle being the 5th century philosopher that you may know, how does Aristotle describe tragedy? Aristotle says this: tragedy happens when good characters make an error, for example, in Romeo and Juliet's case, getting married very quickly, ignoring the family feud, and are brought low. That's simply it. When good characters make an error and are brought low. So when characters make a mistake and then they suffer the consequences of it. Good characters, okay? And being brought low in Romeo and Juliet's case is double suicide, and they kill themselves. And Nino says, this can be psychological genre because the author depicts how terrible people can be. Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with you. There's lots of sociological themes going on about humanity as well. Tribalism, how like we're fundamentally tribal, the jealousy, evil. It's absolutely psychological, and it's a very good depiction of human behavior. I agree with you, Nino, 100%. But anyway, it fits the Aristotelian tragic structure. But Shakespeare does something that goes beyond this. Because like we said, Aristotelian structure, two good characters make a mistake and then suffer the consequences. But Shakespeare goes a step further and he introduces a complexity to the structure. What does he do? He does this. Romeo and Juliet's death leads to peace, right? It's a sacrifice that actually leads towards the two families, the Montagues and the Capulets, they actually come together. The feud is sorted out. So it's more than a tragedy. In a way, it has a happy ending. So Romeo and Juliet's killing themselves is not the end of the story. Opposite. Them killing themselves is precisely what leads towards peace. It is, in a way, a sacrifice for something even greater. Whether or not Romeo and Juliet are aware of it doesn't matter. It's about the narrative. The Capulets make a golden tomb for the Montagues, and the Montagues make a golden tomb for the Capulets to bury each other's children. And basically, it's just this idea that love is a sacrificial action. Love is sacrificial. It's a very Christian message, almost, you know? But it restores peace. So what I've put down here, so can also be read as a narrative of tragic sacrifice. Okay. Let me just see where I've got to. Okay. So the other thing I just want to talk about is we've spoken about sacrifice. We've spoken about tragedy. Do you remember this phrase, star-crossed lovers? Romeo and Juliet are described as star-crossed lovers. And this is a term coined by Shakespeare, but he's also taken it out of astrology. What do you think that term means? What do you think it means if two lovers are star-crossed lovers? What does that mean? What do you think that means? Have a guess. What does it mean if a couple are a pair of star-crossed lovers? I'll give you a hint. It's got something to do with stars. I don't know if any whose meeting was decided in the sky. Okay, close, but there's a bit more detail needed there, Mariam. So whose meeting was decided in the sky is what Mariam says. So the element of that which is correct is the idea that the stars predict one's fate. Like this, that's what astrology is, right? This is what people used to believe. People still believe this, but I personally think astrology is slightly out of date. But anyway, the idea was that the stars reflected the future. That you, by reading the stars, you could predict people's futures. It would tell you what your fate was. Now think of the word crossed, star-crossed. So often when we talk about, okay, when we fall in love with someone, we might say it's almost like the stars aligned. And that's a very positive thing. So it's like the stars aligned telling us that we should be together. But what do you think it means when you say the stars crossed? It's got a slightly, okay, the destiny roads are crossed. Again, good idea, but that's not correct. But good guess. Okay, I'll tell you. Otherwise, I will. I'll become annoying. So, star-crossed essentially means that your fate has been crossed out. Again, you know, good guess, but it's not quite it. It's the idea that their fate is doomed. They're doomed to suffer. They are doomed to have a life of tragedy, and that their life will end in tragedy. The stars have been almost crossed out. Their fate has been crossed out. That's what it means. So if your astrology professor tells you you're destined to be a star-crossed lover, it's not good news. It's bad news. It basically means your romance is going to end in tragedy. There's a positive point for the day. Okay. Any questions about that? Did that make sense? What star-crossed lovers means? It means you're doomed to tragedy. It doesn't mean that the stars are lining up perfectly for you to fall in love with someone. It means, yes, you'll fall in love with someone, but it ain't gonna be good. All right, style. Let's move on to style. Now, I think the best way we can classify the style of Romeo and Juliet, the only way we can classify it, it's made up of prose and poetry. Prose is just basically regular descriptive storytelling, and then poetry is, we know what poetry is. Now, and I'm going to focus on the poetry side of this today in terms of style. And Shakespeare does this in pretty much all of his plays, but I think specifically it gets most, it almost gets highlighted most in this play. So the form of poetry in which he writes his poetry is called iambic pentameter. This is the poetic style that he is using. So what is iambic pentameter? Well, let's divide up the word. An iamb is a poetic foot consisting of a stressed and unstressed syllable. If you don't know what that means, I'll explain that in a moment. And then a pentameter is 5 feet in a line, or in other words, 10 syllables in a line. Okay, so I will show you using the opening passage from Romeo and Juliet, and this is poetry written in iambic pentameter. So first of all, if we look at this first sentence, and this is the same with every sentence, each sentence is made up of 10 syllables, and you can count this yourself. So 2 households, both alike in dignity. 10 syllables. In fair Verona, where we lay our sea. 10 syllables, every single sentence. Every single sentence is 10 syllables, right? Imagine how pedantic you have to be as a writer to make every single sentence of your poetic lines 10 syllables. The iamb here is, so the stress and the unstressed syllable. And it alternates. So the first syllable will be, Shotto Ravelli did that as well. No way. Crazy. I think a lot of poets do it. Okay, he had 16 syllables. Interesting. Yeah, I suppose you can create certain variation with this, and I suppose it can serve a different purpose. But most Shakespeare is in iambic pentameter. I don't know what 16 syllables would be. How would you say hectameter? I don't know. Anyway. So it's also, the iamb is you stress each every other syllable. So I think it would be something like 2 households, both alike in dignity. So it's like dum ba bum ba bum ba bum. Okay, there's a certain rhythm going on with the poetry. Why would you write a play or a piece of poetry like this? Well, I suppose the best explanation for this is it actually reflects the natural rhythm of human speech. Think about how you talk to one another. When you talk to one another, there is actually a certain rhythm going on. Even how I'm talking to you now, notice how I I put more stress on some syllables and less stress on others. I'm also talking in a rhythmic way, right? We all do this. So this is so writing like this is genuinely reflective of human speech. But what it does, it heightens it, it exaggerates it, and that's what poetry and literature does generally. It takes something real, represents it, but represents it in an almost exaggerated way. Okay, that's essentially what art is. It's depicting something, but in a more exaggerated, clear way. Okay. Any questions about style? Oh, I mean, one more thing I could mention is though Shakespeare can actually, he really plays around with this. What is that sentence with Romeo? You've got, "Oh Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Now that's one of the only pieces of poetry in this play that doesn't conform to iambic pentameter. Why doesn't it conform to iambic pentameter? Because of the name Romeo. Romeo, 3 syllables. So if you want to create a piece of poetry in iambic pentameter with the name Romeo, you've only got 7 syllables left to create an interesting sentence. So that's the only place where he has to slightly abandon it. But also, I suppose that puts an emphasis on the name Romeo, because the name Romeo almost becomes out of place in the sentence, and it almost gives more meaning to the name Romeo. So, "Oh Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" That's 14 syllables per line. Okay. Now, the other thing to consider is the original performance conditions. And typically people think that all Shakespeare plays originally were performed in the Globe. Actually, the Globe was built slightly later on in Shakespeare's career. Before that, he was performing things like Romeo and Juliet and The Tempest in smaller indoor venues such as the Curtain Playhouse. And typically these places would be lit by candlelight and stuff like that. But there's something you need to consider here. You've got to consider the performance conditions, and they're completely different from modern theatre. Why? Because when a performance would begin, there wouldn't be any signal to it beginning. Typically, when a performance begins in modern day theatres, the lights go down, the lights come up, the curtains sort of open up, and that sort of gives an indication to the audience that they should shut up and be quiet. In Shakespeare's day, very different. Theatres were kind of like bars, like places you'd go to drink. They're very loud, people would be talking, people would be jeering. So the actors would have to be very loud, and they would have to figure out ways of catching the audience's attention. And it was very much more an interactive experience with the audience. So the audience would often shout at actors, tell the characters what to do. If they didn't like the performance, they start throwing things at them. So it's a very different environment to perform this in. And this is what makes Romeo and Juliet so impressive as a performance. Considering that that's the situation in which actors had to act, it also contains incredible intelligence, incredible artistic license. It's a very complex play, but being performed in a context which is very chaotic. So it's almost like it's a sophisticated comedy as well. That's what we respect about it. It's able to appeal to the masses, but also has these very complex philosophical messages inbuilt into it at the same time. So I think we can really respect Shakespeare for doing that. Yeah. So in a way, his plays also had to pander to the audience. It had to be made suitable to an audience which would be very essentially misbehaved. But people listened because the play was that good. Now, the other topic to move on to is passion, love, and youth. And I'm going to focus slightly more in on the typical thing we think of when we think of Romeo and Juliet, and that is the love story, star-crossed lovers. And there's a couple of things that arise from their relationship. We get confronted with some questions. Often when people read Romeo and Juliet, and I used to have this perspective as well, by the way, when I first read it, I found the whole story very annoying and very immature. The idea of two people, very young people, falling in love at first sight, getting married too quickly, and then committing suicide, to me, basically, I just thought it was stupid. I just found that the characters annoying. Thought it was way over the top and unnecessary. But then what we need to consider is there's different stages of love. You have young love, which lacks perspective, but it is incredibly fresh. It is incredibly raw. It's incredibly innocent, and it's sort of untamed. And sometimes when things are untamed, what's nice about that is they're less rigid. Whereas the elderly, when people become older and fall in love, and this is how Juliet describes it, when people are older, they're pale as lead. They're slower. They feel less passion. The emotions are less intense. I suppose, again, you've got a balance here between young, chaotic love and older, more structured love. And both have their pros and cons, I suppose. But I suppose you could look at the love between Romeo and Juliet as an ideal form of love, because it's the type of love, ideal love, which is attempting to exist in an unjust world. And Romeo and Juliet really do fall in love in an unjust world. They fall in love in a world where they're not supposed to. Even though their love is actually, there's nothing wrong with it. Like there's something quite sweet about it. They generally do love each other. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly harmful about their love. But of course, they're from feuding families. They shouldn't be in love with each other. And generally, what they do is they attempt to change their reality. So if we think about this, the majority of the time in which Romeo and Juliet express their love for each other, it's actually at night time. So you know this typical scene where you've got Romeo down here and Juliet up there on the balcony. That happens at night, when the rest of the reality almost goes to sleep, and this is their opportunity to actually explore their love. They almost inhabit a different reality. But when morning comes, when the day comes, all the realities come back, all the injustices of the world, all the feuding comes back. And I suppose Romeo and Juliet, it sort of gives us a hope of a better world, a world where we can fully express our love for someone without sort of other authorities getting in our way. But it is a question here between responsibility to others and responsibility to your own emotional feeling. Perhaps we should listen to our parents when they advise us against falling in love with someone. Perhaps we should listen to the law. So these are the questions being raised. Remember, we raised these questions earlier. These are the questions this play is confronting us with. How should we love? In a responsible way or in an irresponsible way? I don't know. I guess that question is for you guys to figure out. Yeah. Anything we want to add to that? Any questions? Anything you want to say about love, Romeo and Juliet? Do you think Romeo and Juliet's love is totally inappropriate, naive, and irresponsible? Or do you think it's very real, and do you think it's the most real form of love? Do you think they're just a bunch of kids who don't know what the hell they're doing? Up to you to decide, I guess. In real life, irresponsibility destroys the relationship. Yes, it does. But is that because real life is unjust? Maybe it's real life that should change and not your approach to relationships. Yeah, I mean, I probably agree with you. It's better to be responsible. Real love requires irresponsibility, says Nina. Wow, okay. Got some disagreement there. So we should, if we fall in love, let's just abandon our jobs, our careers, and let's run away with the people we love. Run away with them to some faraway land and live happily ever after, come what may. These ideas are really appealing. There's something, I have to say, that like, you can understand why people write about this in literature all the time. The romance that shouldn't be, the struggle. It's not real. I think this play is very fantastic. Deanna, lots of people agree with you. I think craziness, not irresponsibility. Not every crazy thing is irresponsible. I guess not. I guess there's a balance between the two. I mean, just sorry, one more thing. The one criticism people have of Romeo and Juliet's love is they say that actually it's not the only reason they have such a strong love for each other is precisely because they're trying to have something that society tells them they shouldn't. If they lived in a society where their relationship was no problem, there was no feuding family, the love wouldn't be nearly as strong. So in a way, you could say that their love is constructed as a result of their situation. And in that way, it's actually not real. It only feels like love because they're trying to have something they're not allowed to have. I mean, can you guys relate to that? Could you say that things feel more intense when there's like a struggle surrounding them? Like things have more meaning if they're surrounded in struggle? Maybe. That's the criticism of Romeo and Juliet. That basically they only love each other because they're in a situation where they have to struggle to love each other, and it's the struggle that makes the love more intense. I think it's a very unhealthy mindset, really, because then because plays like Romeo and Juliet often give young men or young girls this idea that I want to have a relationship with someone which will be a struggle, which will be tragic. Like there's a huge appeal in that. People like this idea of tragic love, especially young people like us. Maybe we should grow up and be less naive. Okay, so the impact, you have this is my favorite version of Romeo and Juliet by, oh gosh, what's the director's name? This is the older one. I think it's much better than this version. I don't really like the Leonardo DiCaprio version. Let me just find out what is the director's name, because this is the one I recommend everyone watches because it stays most true to the play. Juliet. This one is by Franco Zeffirelli. Best version of Romeo and Juliet. It's set how Shakespeare would have wanted it to be set, like in some olden times, medieval time, actually in Verona. Whereas the other one is the one with DiCaprio. It's set in modern time. Yeah, it's trying to be symbolic, but it just feels too modern, and it just feels kind of like a naff teenage love story. Whereas Zeffirelli actually really portrays the philosophical element in a much more interesting way. So Nino, if you haven't seen the other version, I seriously recommend you watch it. It's much better, in my opinion. But yeah, so the impact is huge. Like everyone knows Romeo and Juliet, and probably everyone knows the love story between Romeo and Juliet as well. It's considered the greatest love story ever. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it definitely is. But it's also led, and I was telling you about this idea that people have almost idealized this idea of tragic love. You also get this in the book, The Fault in Our Stars. And remember what I was saying about star-crossed lovers? The Fault in Our Stars is a reference to star-crossed lovers. Again, it's this idea there's a fault, there's an issue going on with the star sign, and therefore tragedy is inevitable. So Fault in Our Stars is almost like a proto-Romeo and Juliet story about two people who shouldn't really be together in a different way because she's got an illness, but then it obviously ends in tragedy as well. yeah. Okay, guys. Any questions? Anything else you'd like to say about Romeo and Juliet? Any questions? I will, for anyone who wants some of the references of where I got all my information from, I will get that sent to you. I believe we already have most people's emails, so we can get that sent to you. Any questions? Anything else we'd like to say? When will be next? I believe the next meeting, it doesn't say anything here. The next meeting will be on Friday next week, and it will be one of two texts. It'll either be The Merchant of Venice or it will be Measure for Measure. Definitely one of those two, because we'll be doing Shakespeare for 2 more weeks, because I believe it was Shakespeare's birthday quite recently, or it's about to happen, so we're having like a Shakespeare month going on as well. Okay, guys, I think we'll end it there. So like I said, I recommend you watch this film. What theme? Yeah, theme will still be Shakespeare. Measure for Measure, to give you an idea of the key themes in Measure for Measure. Measure for Measure is actually also very political, and actually that's an example of Shakespeare putting himself in lots of hot water, because he actually sets Measure for Measure in London. Is it in London? No, gosh, no, he doesn't set it in England. He sets it in a different country as well. But in Measure for Measure, there's huge resemblances to the political structure in England as well. So Shakespeare was really, really treading fine lines there. But Measure for Measure is all about the law, religion, responsibility. I personally prefer Measure for Measure to Romeo and Juliet. I think Measure for Measure is much more interesting. And that might be because I'm more interested in politics. I don't know. Okay, guys, if you don't have any more questions, I will say goodbye. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your suggestions. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, a lovely weekend, and I will see you next time.